Have you ever noticed that the more you chase someone, the more they pull away? The more love and effort you give, the colder they seem to become. And then, strangely, the moment you stop chasing, they start looking for you again, texting you again, thinking about you again. That is not random. There is a psychological pattern behind it. And if you stay with this idea, you will understand a shift in mindset that can completely change how you experience relationships. Most people never learn this, so they end up stuck in cycles of chasing, overthinking, and trying to fix something that keeps slipping away. Meanwhile, they lose their self-respect without even realizing it. But what you are feeling right now is not just emotion, it is psychology in action. Avoidant behavior often creates confusion. At first, someone may feel very close, very interested, even emotionally present. They message often, show care, and make you feel chosen. Then suddenly, the energy shifts, the warmth disappears, the distance grows, and you are left trying to figure out what went wrong. Your mind starts replaying everything, every message, every word, every small moment. You begin to blame yourself. Maybe you cared too much. Maybe you did something wrong. Maybe you were not enough. This is where the emotional trap begins. Because when someone pulls away, your brain reacts like it is experiencing loss. Research shows that emotional rejection activates similar pain systems in the brain as physical pain. That means you are not just sad. Your mind is reacting like something valuable was taken away. That is why you keep thinking about them, checking your phone, and feeling uneasy in silence. What you are really chasing is not the person anymore. It is emotional relief. This cycle becomes even stronger because of inconsistency. When someone gives you attention sometimes and then withdraws it at other times, your brain becomes more attached, not less. This is the same psychological mechanism seen in addiction patterns. Unpredictable rewards keep the mind hooked because it keeps waiting for the next moment of comfort. Slowly, your focus shifts away from your own life. Your mood starts depending on their responses. Your peace becomes controlled by their attention. And that is where the imbalance begins. Because when someone realizes you will stay no matter how inconsistent they are, the emotional pressure disappears for them but increases for you. The harder you try to win over someone who is emotionally unavailable, the less they tend to value the pressure. Not because you are unworthy, but because human psychology naturally stops appreciating what feels always available. When there is no fear of losing someone, urgency disappears. Avoidant individuals often struggle with emotional closeness. When they feel pressure, expectations, or emotional dependency, they tend to retreat, not always out of cruelty, but because closeness can feel overwhelming to them. So when you chase harder, it can actually reinforce their need for distance. But something important changes when you stop. When you pull your attention back, when you stop over-explaining, when you stop chasing answers, a new dynamic begins. Your absence becomes noticeable, and absence speaks louder than presence. Silence creates space for reflection. Distance creates awareness, and suddenly they are faced with something they were not paying attention to before. Your energy is no longer immediately available. This shift often creates curiosity, not because you are playing games, but because human minds react strongly to change and uncertainty. When someone who was always emotionally accessible becomes calm and detached, it breaks expectations. It makes them wonder what changed. But the real purpose here is not to make someone chase you. It is to stop losing yourself in the process. Because every time you overextend, overtext, or over-explain your worth to someone who is already distant, you slowly disconnect from your own value. Energy is felt before words are understood. When someone senses emotional dependence, attraction weakens because it turns connection into pressure, and pressure rarely creates closeness. Over time, many people begin linking their self-worth to another person's behavior. If they respond, you feel okay. If they ignore you, you feel empty. That creates emotional instability, where your inner peace is no longer inside you, but in someone else's hands. The truth is, real strength is not about forcing connection. It is about no longer abandoning yourself for one. It is about becoming emotionally stable even when someone else is inconsistent. When you reach that point, everything changes. You stop reacting from fear, you stop analyzing every detail, you stop chasing clarity from confusion, and you start choosing peace over emotional chaos. And ironically, that is often when the dynamic shifts again. Not because you used tricks, but because you are no longer emotionally predictable. You are no longer overgiving your attention. You are no longer feeding the cycle. Now the silence is on your side, not as punishment, but as protection. Because at the deepest level, this is not about winning someone back. It is about rebuilding yourself to a point where you are no longer dependent on someone else's attention to feel whole. And once you get there, you begin to understand something very clear. The goal was never to be chosen by someone who keeps leaving. The goal is to become someone who no longer loses themselves trying to be chosen at all. To someone who values consistency, all of this can feel painful and even unfair. But from an avoidant psychological pattern, emotional closeness can trigger an internal discomfort they often cannot explain in words. And this is where most people make a serious mistake. They take the withdrawal personally. They assume, if I were better, more attractive, more understanding, more perfect, they would stay. But emotional avoidance is not something you fix by becoming flawless. You cannot heal someone else's fear by overextending yourself or sacrificing your own emotional stability. In reality, no amount of extra effort can force emotional readiness in another person, and the harder you try to pull someone emotionally closer, the more unstable the connection often becomes. Because for someone who struggles with emotional intimacy, too much closeness can feel like pressure. And when pressure builds, their instinct is to step back, not move forward. This is why emotional intelligence matters far more than emotional intensity. A calm mind understands timing, boundaries, and emotional space. A desperate mind tries to force outcomes, and forced emotional connection rarely becomes healthy attachment. If you look closely at human behavior, there is a clear pattern. People do not consistently value what is constantly chasing them, but they do become aware of what calmly withdraws. There is something powerful about restraint, about knowing when to stop investing energy into someone who repeatedly creates uncertainty. Because restraint communicates self-worth without a single word. When you stop trying to convince someone to choose you, you send a message that is stronger than any emotional explanation ever could. You show that your identity is not dependent on their approval, and that shift is noticeable. Most people never reach this point because they stay focused on trying to change someone who is not emotionally available. They confuse attachment with love. They confuse emotional struggle with emotional depth. But real connection should not require you to abandon your peace just to keep it alive. True emotional maturity starts when you begin recognizing patterns instead of excuses. You notice how people behave when things get serious. You see who disappears when emotional depth appears. You observe who only returns when they feel loss, boredom, or uncertainty about losing access to you. And once your awareness sharpens, your standards naturally rise. You stop chasing reassurance from inconsistent people. You stop over-explaining your value. You stop accepting confusion disguised as care. At that point, something interesting happens psychologically. The dynamic begins to shift. The person who once felt in control of distance starts experiencing uncertainty themselves because the access they took for granted is no longer guaranteed. This is where loss aversion comes into play. People tend to react more strongly to losing something than gaining something new. So when your emotional presence becomes less available, your value becomes more noticeable through contrast. Your absence starts to matter. Your silence becomes noticeable. Your reduced attention becomes meaningful. And this is often why avoidant individuals reappear after distance. Not always because they have fully changed, but because your absence creates emotional contrast. They begin to remember what was once freely available, and the lack of it creates curiosity and reflection. But this is also the moment where many people lose progress. The moment attention returns, they immediately reopen emotional access. They forget the inconsistency, the confusion, the emotional exhaustion, and fall back into the same cycle. That is why emotional control is more important than emotional desire. You must learn to observe behavior, not words. Anyone can say they miss you. Anyone can return when they feel lonely. But consistency over time is what reveals true emotional change. Without that awareness, people keep repeating the same pattern. They respond to chemistry instead of behavior. They hold on to potential instead of reality. They react to moments instead of patterns. But emotional maturity sees clearly. It understands that attention is not commitment, return is not growth, and temporary affection is not stability. And this understanding changes everything, not because it gives you power over someone else, but because it gives you power over yourself. The power to stay grounded instead of reactive, the power to pause instead of panic, the power to protect your peace instead of abandoning it for temporary connection. And when you reach that level, your entire emotional presence shifts. You are no longer driven by fear of losing someone. You are no longer dependent on validation. You are no longer controlled by inconsistency. Instead, you become steady, and that steadiness is exactly what disrupts the old dynamic, because avoidant patterns are built around emotional unpredictability from the other side. When that unpredictability disappears, the system no longer works the same way. But the goal is not to control someone's reaction. The goal is to stop losing yourself in the process, because the strongest emotional position is not the ability to make someone stay. It is the ability to remain whole even when they do not. And when that becomes your foundation, everything else either aligns with it or falls away naturally. And in the end, the real shift is not about who comes back or who stays, but about who you become when you finally stop abandoning yourself for inconsistent love.